Number: the gas valve gambit. The metal wheel turned with surprising ease for something that controlled the natural gas supply to 47 homes. Karen Whitfield's perfectly manicured finger pointed at me like she was casting a spell, her voice cutting through the Texas heat with the authority of someone who'd never been told no. That fence and cabin were illegal structures, Mr. Rodriguez. The HOA has every right to remove safety hazards. Behind her, a bulldozer sat idle next to the splintered remains of my grandmother's hand-built log cabin. Yellow utility flags scattered around the destruction like confetti after a particularly vicious party. What Karen didn't know was that 15 years of pipeline engineering experience had taught me exactly where every gas line ran beneath her precious neighborhood, and the manual shutoff valve was sitting right there in a concrete housing, waiting for someone with the legal authority to use it. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level as I pulled out my phone to record what came next, "I think we need to discuss what constitutes a real safety hazard." 3 days earlier, I'd been Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez, a pipeline safety engineer from Houston, driving my pickup truck through the East Texas countryside toward what should have been my inheritance and fresh start. My grandmother Elena had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, and her 5-acre property outside Meadowbrook represented everything I'd lost and hoped to rebuild. The deed transfer had gone through probate without complications, and I'd taken early retirement from my engineering firm to restore the century-old homestead where Elena had taught me to whittle wood, fix engines, and understand that sometimes the most important battles are fought quietly over decades rather than loudly over days. The property sat at the intersection of 2 county roads, with Elena's 1,987 log cabin positioned on a small rise that offered views of rolling pasture land dotted with oak trees. The wooden fence that marked our boundaries had been built by my grandfather in the 1990s, sturdy cedar posts connected by rails that had weathered 30 years of Texas storms without requiring major repairs. Elena had always been meticulous about property maintenance, keeping detailed records of every improvement, permit, and survey marker. She'd also been surprisingly secretive about certain aspects of land ownership, mentioning easements and utility agreements but never explaining their significance. The drive from Houston usually took 2 hours, but I'd stopped at a roadside diner in Huntsville to read Elena's final letter one more time. She'd pressed the sealed envelope into my hands during our last conversation in the hospital, making me promise to open it only after arriving at the property. Her handwriting was still steady despite the medications, filled with the same methodical precision she'd brought to everything from gardening to bookkeeping. "Tank, this land isn't just land," she'd written. "It's where your family learned to stand up for what's right. The metal box behind the fireplace contains everything you'll need when the time comes. Trust Betty Chen at the law office on Main Street, and remember that the most important fights are won with paperwork, not anger." I'd driven past the Meadowbrook city limits sign with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation, imagining the projects I'd tackle first. The cabin needed a new roof, the fence could use fresh stain, and Elena's vegetable garden was probably overrun with weeds after months of neglect. What I found instead was a crime scene that made Hurricane Harvey's aftermath look organized. The cabin where I'd spent countless childhood summers had been reduced to scattered timber and twisted metal. The fence that had marked our property line for 3 decades lay in pieces like broken bones. Fresh tire tracks from heavy machinery scarred the earth, and a newly carved dirt road ran straight through what used to be my backyard. Karen Whitfield stood in the middle of this destruction, wearing pristine white cowboy boots and a designer blouse that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the 95-degree heat, and she held a clipboard with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Behind her stood 2 other HOA board members with matching clipboards and the dead-eyed expressions of middle management bureaucrats who'd found their calling in making other people's lives miserable. "Mr. Rodriguez, I presume," she said, extending a manicured hand that I declined to shake. "I'm Karen Whitfield, president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. I regret that you had to discover this situation without proper notification, but emergency safety measures sometimes require immediate action." Her tone suggested that she was doing me a favor by destroying my property, like a doctor delivering news about necessary surgery. "The structures you see here were built without proper HOA approval, and pose significant safety hazards to our community. We've documented multiple code violations, setback requirement failures, and architectural review committee oversights that left us no choice but to remove these hazardous materials. The escalation began with a phone call the next morning. I'd spent the night in my pickup truck, too stunned to drive back to Houston and too angry to think clearly about next steps. Elena's metal box had revealed utility easement agreements, property surveys, and a thick folder of correspondence with something called Whitfield Energy Services that made my engineering background suddenly very relevant. The box also contained a letter from Betty Chen confirming that Karen had been making inquiries about purchasing Elena's property for the past 3 years, always declining to explain why she was so interested in 5 acres of rural land that couldn't be worth more than $50,000. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is Karen Whitfield," came the crisp voice through my phone at 7:30 a.m. "I trust you've had time to review the documentation our committee provided yesterday regarding the removal of unpermitted structures from your property. I'm calling to discuss next steps for bringing your land into compliance with current HOA standards." She spoke with the practiced efficiency of someone who delivered similar messages many times before. "First, you'll need to file a restoration plan with our architectural review committee within 30 days. Second, any future construction must receive pre-approval through our standard review process. Third, we'll need to schedule a soil stability assessment to determine whether your property is suitable for safe construction given the utility infrastructure running beneath it." What made this conversation particularly interesting was that Karen seemed to know far more about the utility infrastructure on my property than someone should learn from reviewing HOA documents. She mentioned specific pipeline depths, pressure ratings, and safety buffer zones that weren't included in any public records. When I asked how she'd obtained this technical information, she explained that her husband's company, Whitfield Energy Services, held the regional natural gas distribution contract and had been monitoring pipeline safety in our area for years. "The gas main that serves our entire community runs directly through your property," she continued, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background, like she was reading from an official report. "Any construction activities require coordination with utility providers to prevent accidents that could affect 47 households. That's why the emergency removal was necessary. Your grandmother's unpermitted structures were creating safety hazards that could have resulted in service interruptions or worse." She paused dramatically, letting the implications sink in. "I'm sure you understand that community safety takes precedence over individual property rights, especially when those rights haven't been properly established through legal channels." The harassment escalated systematically over the following weeks. First came the certified letters claiming that my RV violated camping ordinances and constituted an unpermitted dwelling that posed fire hazards to neighboring properties. Then arrived inspection notices alleging that Elena's vegetable garden contained invasive plant species that violated county agricultural regulations. The coup de grace was a formal complaint filed with the State Environmental Protection Agency claiming that my property contained illegal septic modifications that were contaminating groundwater supplies. Each accusation required time-consuming responses, costly inspections, and legal consultations that drained both my energy and bank account. Karen had clearly done this before, because every complaint was crafted to exploit regulatory gray areas where proving innocence required expensive expert testimony. The septic system that Elena had properly permitted and maintained for 20 years suddenly needed a hydrogeological survey costing $3,000. The native wildflowers she'd planted to support local bee populations were reclassified as noxious weeds requiring professional remediation. Even the gravel driveway that had existed since the 1980s was deemed a potential source of erosion requiring an environmental impact assessment. What made the situation more frustrating was discovering how Karen had systematically isolated me from potential allies. Jake Thompson, the contractor who'd maintained Elena's property for 15 years, apologetically explained that he couldn't take any work from me because Karen had threatened to report him for licensing violations unless he severed all business relationships with the Rodriguez family. The local hardware store owner mentioned that Karen had suggested my account was past due and that extending credit might not be wise. Even the mail carrier seemed nervous about delivering certified letters to my address. mentioning that the HOA had raised concerns about aggressive dogs on my property, despite the fact that I didn't own any pets. The most insidious aspect of Karen's campaign was how she'd weaponized the bureaucracy itself. County inspectors arrived unannounced to investigate complaints that had been filed anonymously but with enough specific detail to suggest insider knowledge. Environmental protection agents showed up with soil testing equipment based on reports that described Elena's composting area as a potential biohazard. Building code enforcement officers photographed my RV from multiple angles, measuring setbacks and documenting violations that could result in daily fines until corrected. Each interaction followed the same pattern: apologetic officials explaining that they were required to investigate all complaints regardless of their apparent merit, followed by expensive compliance requirements that seemed designed to exhaust my resources rather than address legitimate safety concerns. The septic inspection revealed a system that exceeded current standards. The soil testing found contamination levels well below regulatory thresholds. The structural assessment confirmed that Elena's cabin had been built to code and properly maintained, but each clean bill of health came with administrative fees, inspection costs, and paperwork requirements that added up to thousands of dollars in expenses for problems that hadn't existed until Karen decided to create them. The breakthrough came when I finally visited Betty Chen's law office above the old hardware store on Main Street. Betty was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and the kind of warm smile that reminded me of Elena, and she'd been quietly documenting Karen's activities for longer than anyone realized. "Your grandmother spent the last 5 years preparing for exactly this situation," Betty explained, pulling out a thick folder that made my inheritance documents look like a grocery list. "Elena knew Karen would eventually make a move on your land, and she wanted you to be ready." The folder contained correspondence with the Federal Pipeline Administration, detailed maps of utility easements, and most importantly, a series of photographs documenting previous incidents where Karen had used similar tactics against other property owners. Elena hadn't just been collecting evidence of current harassment. She'd been building a federal case against a pattern of corruption that stretched back over a decade. The photographs showed Karen meeting with county officials in parking lots, passing envelopes that clearly weren't documents. They documented building inspectors walking away from Whitfield Energy job sites without conducting inspections while Karen watched from her SUV. Most damning of all, they revealed 3 other properties in the area where Karen had used identical tactics to force families to sell their land at below market prices. Betty opened a second folder that contained the real bombshell: recorded phone conversations between Karen and county planning officials discussing how to handle the Rodriguez problem when I inherited the property. Elena had been more tech-savvy than anyone realized, because she'd managed to record Karen explicitly discussing plans to manufacture safety violations and use emergency demolition permits to destroy structures that had been legally built and properly maintained. "The old woman's been too smart to give us an opening," Karen's voice came through crystal clear on the digital recording. "But once she's gone and her grandson shows up, we can manufacture whatever violations we need. County owes us enough favors that we can get emergency demolition permits for anything we claim is a safety hazard." The planning official's response was equally damning: "Just make sure the paperwork looks legitimate after the fact. We can backdate permits if necessary, but I need plausible deniability if anyone starts asking questions." The technical documents revealed why Karen was so determined to acquire my specific property. The natural gas distribution system that served her entire HOA neighborhood depended on a pressure regulation station located directly beneath Elena's cabin site. The pipeline easement agreements dating back to 1987 had granted my family certain emergency access rights, including the authority to shut off gas flow in case of safety violations or unauthorized excavation near pipeline infrastructure. Elena had been quietly maintaining these rights for 30 years, collecting annual easement fees and keeping detailed records of every safety inspection and maintenance activity. Most importantly, Betty showed me federal pipeline safety regulations that made Karen's excavation work a serious criminal violation. Unauthorized digging within 50 feet of a pressure regulation station carried penalties of up to $2 million per incident and potential criminal charges for endangering public safety. The bulldozer operation that had destroyed Elena's cabin had come within inches of damaging equipment that controlled gas pressure for the entire neighborhood, creating exactly the kind of safety emergency that justified immediate response under federal protocols. The confrontation came on a Friday morning when Karen arrived with what she clearly thought was her trump card: eminent domain paperwork signed by 3 county commissioners declaring my property a public safety hazard, requiring immediate seizure for essential infrastructure development. She'd brought 2 attorneys and a county planning representative, apparently confident that government authority would override whatever legal objections I might raise. "Mr. Rodriguez," she announced, stepping out of her white SUV with the satisfaction of someone about to deliver a checkmate move, "I regret that our previous discussions haven't resulted in voluntary compliance with community safety requirements. The county has determined that your property contains critical infrastructure that's too important to remain under private control, especially given recent threats against public utilities." She gestured toward her legal team, like she was introducing cavalry arriving to save the day. What Karen didn't anticipate was that I'd spent the morning setting up a live stream on my phone, broadcasting the federal investigation that was already underway. Agent Martinez from the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration had arrived at dawn with a team of investigators who'd been building a case against Whitfield Energy Services for months. My complaint had simply provided them with the local contact they needed to expand their investigation into what was rapidly becoming the largest corruption case in county history. "Mrs. Whitfield," Agent Martinez said, consulting her tablet with methodical precision, "our preliminary investigation has revealed significant discrepancies between your company's reported safety compliance and the actual condition of pipeline infrastructure in this area. We've also discovered that several government authorizations you've been citing appear to have been issued through irregular channels that warrant further investigation." She looked up with the expression prosecutors get when they know they have enough evidence to bury someone. "Additionally, the eminent domain proceedings you've initiated are based on safety assessments that your own company's inspection records contradict, which raises questions about potential fraud in your dealings with county officials." The live stream audience had grown to over 3,000 viewers watching Karen's perfect composure crack under pressure she'd never anticipated. Her attorneys discovered that their eminent domain paperwork was based on safety assessments that contradicted federal inspection reports. The county planning representative found himself answering questions about backdated permits and mysterious emergency authorizations that had been issued without proper documentation. Most importantly, Agent Martinez had contacted the families whose properties Karen had previously acquired through similar tactics, and all of them were suddenly very interested in talking to federal investigators. But the moment that delivered complete satisfaction was when I walked over to the concrete housing containing the manual shutoff valve Elena had told me about in her documents. The metal wheel was exactly where the utility map said it would be, painted bright yellow with warning signs explaining that unauthorized operation carried federal criminal penalties. "Gentlemen," I called out to the federal agents, pulling out my phone to record my actions, "based on my professional assessment as a licensed pipeline engineer and the documented evidence of unauthorized excavation within 50 feet of this pressure regulation station, I'm implementing an emergency safety shutdown of gas service to this distribution area, pending proper inspection and repair of damaged equipment." The sound of the valve turning was like a community exhaling after holding its breath for years. Within minutes, pilot lights were going out across the neighborhood, water heaters were shutting down, and heating systems were becoming expensive decorations. Karen's face went through several shades of white as she realized that her entire community was suddenly without natural gas, and her husband's company lacked the proper certifications to restore service without federal oversight. The resolution exceeded every fantasy I'd entertained about justice being served. Karen's confession, delivered in front of federal agents and broadcast live to over 20,000 viewers, revealed a corruption network that had been operating for years under the cover of community safety and HOA authority. She admitted to systematic fraud, bribery of public officials, and using her position to steal properties from families who couldn't fight back. The county planning representative was arrested on the spot for providing confidential government information to private developers in exchange for construction contracts awarded to his brother's firm. Agent Martinez coordinated arrests throughout the county, while homeowners who'd been living under Karen's authoritarian control for years finally understood the difference between leadership and tyranny. The newly formed community committee elected Jake Thompson as interim HOA president and approached me with a proposal Elena would have loved. They wanted to create a legitimate community access route that would be properly planned, legally permitted, and designed to benefit everyone, rather than serving as a private shortcut for commercial interests. Whitfield Energy Services faced federal shutdown and criminal charges that would take years to resolve. Karen and her husband were looking at potential prison sentences and financial penalties that would bankrupt their ranch operation. The three families whose properties had been stolen through similar tactics filed civil lawsuits seeking millions in damages. Most satisfying of all, the Highway Department's investigation revealed that Karen's insider information about upcoming development projects had been obtained through illegal means, invalidating every land acquisition she'd made based on confidential planning documents. The gas service was restored after 72 hours, but only after the community had reorganized itself around principles of transparency, cooperation, and actual safety, rather than manufactured crises designed to concentrate power in one person's hands. Karen's exile from the neighborhood she'd terrorized was complete and permanent. The new HOA leadership implemented oversight procedures that would prevent any future abuse of authority, and Elena's property became the site of a community center dedicated to educating homeowners about their legal rights and responsibilities. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting better. Elena had spent 30 years quietly documenting injustice and preparing the tools I'd need to fight back when the time came. She'd understood that real community strength comes from knowledge, cooperation, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when powerful people try to intimidate you into silence. And every time I drive past that new community center built where Karen's illegal road used to run, I remember Elena's final lesson. Son, this land isn't just land. It's where you learn that patience, preparation, and principle will always defeat bullying, corruption, and greed. The live stream footage became evidence in multiple federal cases and sparked a statewide investigation into HOA abuse that resulted in new legislation protecting homeowners from exactly the kind of systematic harassment Karen had perfected. Sometimes justice moves slowly, but when it finally arrives, it's worth the wait.